What everyone wants to know is, how did you get him on camera and have the access at all? The New York Post wanted this guy. CNN wanted this guy. Everybody wanted to talk to him. How did you get him?
Thank you, Brian. So basically, I started communicating with Gil in November 2013.
Match.com? How'd you find him?
No. You know, the media attention had really died down at that point. He was alone in prison. He had been in prison and spent 7 months in solitary confinement. He had entered general population. And you know, I think he really wanted to talk. He did not testify, I think, smartly during his trial. And so, you know, it was about talking to him and trying to figure out him as a human being.
And Andrew, at what point did you get involved as well with the production?
Sure. Well, Aaron and I met, I believe, towards the end of the fall of 2013. And that was the time when Erin, said she wanted to do something with the intersection of the internet and other themes. And we went to Sheila and Sarah at HBO, and the conversation ranged over 2 hours on so many different aspects of the issues, and thought crimes sort of was where it landed.
Yeah. This phrase, thought crimes, has it been around? I've never really thought about this issue until, we see this film here.
We see it in terrorism. It's at the heart of many of the terrorism prosecutions and the controversies of terrorism today, where people who are implicated as either al-Qaeda conspirators, I guess tomorrow it'll be ISIS sympathizers, but really more al-Qaeda, because there's some measure of inspiration from people that they're remotely connected to. And the question is, are they in fact conspiring to do something, or have they only thought about it? So there is some degree of discussion about how zealous terrorism intervention needs to be, but that sets the template. And then, of course, when it comes to sexuality, I think what the audience needs to be aware of is that one of the most spirited debates within sex offender assessment and treatment is research that has reflected that for many people who are consumers of child pornography and were thought to be only consumers, that closer examination after trial has demonstrated a number of them to actually be actors and not just consumers of child pornography. So these are areas where one wonders, even from a clinical sense, of does it stop with a thought, or does it extend beyond that?
And yet, as Laurie says, Laurie, you say toward the end of the film, people have to be able to figure out themselves between thoughts and actions. And in that space is where you define who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if this is on. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I got a quiet voice. Child pornography is actually a very interesting test case, and I'd like to bring people's awareness to the fact that when governments around the world, including the British government, which is obviously a big concern of mine, want to impose greater surveillance powers and want to broaden their use of state surveillance, child pornography and sex offense and terrorism, we call them the three horsemen of the infopocalypse. They're the things.
The infopocalypse.
Actually, there's four. Child pornography and terrorism are the main two. The horsemen of the infopocalypse, that is Cory Doctorow's phrase, and it's the things that always come up when states wish to impose greater surveillance. And child pornography is a very interesting case because, of course, in the creation of most child pornography, a crime has already been committed. It's a case whereby just making the thing and being involved in the consumption of the thing is a crime no matter what you then go on to do. So it's kind of a red herring in this discussion. But I'm really interested in how these debates about what people should be allowed to think impact future laws about what we are allowed to see.
Professor Dershowitz, now that you've seen the film, what do you come thinking about taking away here?
Well, we live in what I call the preventive state, and that preventive state really began after 9/11, and as Michael said, we're trying desperately to try to predict and anticipate all kinds of horrible crimes, including terrorism and including abuse of children, abuse of women, but it's an extraordinarily dangerous situation, and there aren't 2 points on this continuum one of which is when you conspire with somebody to do it, and the other is when you just think about it. There's an intermediate position, which is going to scare the hell out of you when I tell you what the law is. The law today is that if you are a lone wolf, either a lone wolf predator, child predator, or a lone wolf terrorist, the law today can't really get you. You can do virtually anything. You can buy the material. You can have a plan. As long as your plan is not imminent and specific, the law of attempts doesn't really cover it. So what's confusing about this case is that they knew that. So they charged him with a phony conspiracy. This is not a conspiracy case. He didn't agree with anybody to do anything. He was on a chat. There's enough, if there is a conspiracy, there's clearly enough overt acts to get him. So the issue in the Court of Appeals, I'm sure, will be, is this a conspiracy at all? Was there ever an agreement to do something specific? Because if there wasn't, and the law of attempts covers it, it goes very, very far. Now, I am very frightened by what Michael said when he used the example of child pornography. Let's assume 100% of people who rape children have consumed child pornography. 100%. What does that tell us if only 1/100% of people who consume child pornography then go on to abuse children? That's the relevant statistic, not the statistic about how many people who do abuse have watched child pornography, because you won't know when you step in whether or not the person has or has not abused. If he's abused, of course, you can put him in jail. But if he hasn't, you don't know whether he's that 1/100% of people who consume child pornography and then go on to do it. The same thing is true with terrorism. The vast majority of people who have engaged in modern-day terrorism have been influenced by imams and jihadist talk, but a very tiny percentage of people who listen to imams or jihadist talk go out to commit terrorism. So the problem of how to avoid numerous false positives while also avoiding a significant number of false negatives is where the difficult problem arises, and why we have the concept of proof beyond a reasonable doubt and better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent be wrongly confined. I hope this case is reversed on appeal, that is affirmed on appeal, that is that the conviction remains reversed on appeal, but I hope they do it in a way that takes into account the enormous dangers. This case is not just about this man. This is about the future of the preventive state in America, and it's about all of our liberties.
I know Lori wants to chime in, but Julia, can you tell us what is next? So May 12th is the next date on the calendar. May 11th, by the way, we see this premiere on HBO. So on May 12th, that's really the decision day for his fate. For his
It's
future.
not the decision day, but it will be argued before the Second
argument day,
Circuit.
right.
So it is before the Second Circuit, the question of whether this was a real conspiracy. And that is exactly the question. The question isn't whether Gil Valley has sick thoughts that scare us. He does. In fact, there are about 40,000 people on the internet right now, this second, having the same exact kind of sick thoughts. And that's one conversation. But the conversation that's before the Second Circuit is whether this is a crime that we want to deprive somebody of their liberty for potentially the rest of their life. And there is no evidence that this was a real agreement. These are people in cyberspace. They don't even know each other's names. They just know each other's screen names, talking about really sick, disturbing fantasies. And that's what it is. It's a sick, troubling video game.
So you really think it's storytelling?
It is storytelling, and the website makes it clear. The website on its very first page says, come in, meet other people like you, explore your deepest, darkest fantasies. This is fantasy only. And if you read the chats, and there's lots of them, and on the defense team we've read them many, many, many times, it's clear it's storytelling. There's different types of storytelling. There are the storytelling that they're talking about, that's in the movie where they say, this is a story, let's talk. And then there's storytelling where they don't start by saying this is a story. It's a different kind of storytelling. It's a movie that seems really real. It's a video game that has really great graphics.
Gil saw the film for the first time yesterday. Do you know what he thought? He's not here with us tonight.
No, he saw it with the defense team yesterday. I think for all of us, the most compelling moment really was the juror when she says, we convicted him not for what he did, but for what we thought he wanted to do. And for us, it confirms what we have always been saying here.
Well, what you said actually outside on that rainy day.
Yeah, that they convicted because they couldn't get past ugly thoughts. That's a very, very scary notion. For Gil, who was convicted of a crime he didn't commit, but for all of us, that the jury system can fail that way, and that's why judges get to look at it, and that's where we are.
Lori, I know you wanted to chime in down there.
I agree very much with Julia, and I think the genius of this film is partly that I imagine many people watching it in the audience right now will have had thoughts of like, oh my God, what have I been typing into Google? Oh my God, what am I afraid of in my darkest self? And I imagine there's a few people here who've been worried about that, and that is the question. That's what we. Is that not what we're trying to prosecute here? I wanted to bring it back to child pornography, actually, which people started talking about, which I think is very telling. Obviously, everybody is frightened about danger to children. But right now, the biggest danger to children is not child pornography in the United States. Even if we're just talking about sexual abuse and physical abuse of children, the biggest danger to American children is the American family. Most child abuse happens within families. It's people the children know. It is not people who are strangers who are spurred on by things they see on the internet. Some statistics suggest that 1 in 4 little girls are sexually abused as children, most of them by members of their own family. And I think it is people are very concerned about tackling the nasty thoughts and the nasty images out there, but when it comes to actually tackling the real root causes of abuse and violence in society, I see a lack there. I see a hypocrisy there.
Let me ask Aaron, did you come to any conclusions yourself as the filmmaker about Gil as a person, about his upbringing, about his family situation? You allude to the divorce. You allude to what might have led him to these. Did you reach any conclusions yourself?
I mean, I think you'll see through the film that what we tried to do was be really balanced. And it was from my point of reference that I didn't want this entire room to know how I feel. I want each and every person in this room to figure out how they feel about it. Gil Valley did have, a somewhat hard upbringing. His parents got divorced. There were certain elements of his childhood, but we can't really add that up like 1, 2, 3 contributing factor. That's why he was on this website. There is no such simple solution. It's the complex answers that we really have to think about.
What was the most interesting storytelling device in your mind that you used? I mean, the Google searches, typing in those words one by one, seeing where he's going, was one of the most compelling ones to me.
What do you think, Andrew? What was your favorite?
Well, I think
I want to hear
It's
what
obviously
he thinks. He's my producer.
it's almost painful to watch the chats unfold.
right,
as well.
and I think that roller coaster that you go on while watching the film, the sort of vacillation between thinking that this person is capable of these things he's writing about, but also understanding the humanity of a man who's in his kitchen with his mother. When we were setting forth on this journey, Aaron and Andrew Kaufman, the editor, we talked about having the viewer go back and forth in that sort of in the mind of this obsessive person with this pathology, but then also sort of pulling out to 20,000 miles in the sky and understanding all the legal issues.
And I really liked the distorted effects on the pornography, and that was entirely an inspiration by Andrew Kaufman, because this movie can be a little hard to watch, but when you look at that pornography, it's like you're entering into a different world. It is part of a fantasy, and so I thought that was a really great device employed by Andrew.
We're going to go to questions from the audience in a couple of minutes. Michael, it strikes me that the phrasing of the tabloid press, Cannibal Cop, changed this case so profoundly, turned it into something that it might not have been.
Well, the press, and I've had that experience. Look, I'm waiting for the verdict on the Eitan Pace case, and I was a principal witness for the prosecution, and I've watched the distinction between what the press reports and sitting in court, and you'd never know you actually sat in court for what some of the writers, and writers are human. And so I think one of the fascinating things about participating in a case is that you come to recognize and respect that journalists have to distill what they think is important into something that's brief, something that will get them on the front page. And you cannot get away from some of the sensational elements of a case like this, and a person can be turned into a cartoon. I need to correct something just so that the audience, because I may have actually been misleading based on what my distinguished colleague, Professor Dershowitz, said. What I said was that research on people who were convicted and incarcerated for only child porn consumption, only that, on closer study, many of them were found to actually be abusing children. It wasn't the reverse. Granted, anyone who's abusing children, at some point, they cultivated a deviant fetish. And again, it's important for the audience to understand that there's a different perspective from that of a clinician and a physician to that from an attorney. Obviously, those interested in justice, deservedly and understandably in this wonderful society that we have a threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt. But when you go into an emergency room and you say, doctor, these are my symptoms, he doesn't say, well, I can't give you an opinion beyond a reasonable doubt. You come to an opinion based on the clinical information within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, and we have to look at all the evidence. I don't know what I think about this case. I don't have an opinion one way or the other. I do think, however, that you can't think about thought crime without recognizing, going beyond, and this also just touches on the point that you made about what endangers people. The reason that people look at terrorism differently, and yet it really flirts with the border of thought crime, is because if you get it wrong, you got another 9/11. You got somebody who was standing there looking at a poster saying, you see those buildings? I'm going to bring them down. And you had somebody who didn't see something and say something. And so there is a reason. It's just not so simple. And it's not so simple even for a clinician. So I think that those are at least a clinician's perspective, which may be very different from a justice perspective.
So, Professor, what do we do? We're all at home Googling something.
Well, we err on the side of liberty, but we acknowledge that we pay a heavy price for it. When we free people who may or may not, or who probably will or have, we pay a heavy price. There may be more 9/11s. There may be some children who are abused. My one, it's not a criticism of the film, but this case is too easy. Because we see him, we get to know him, and in the end he says, I'll never do this again. We believe him. I believe him. I don't think he is a danger. I believe him, absolutely believe him. I wouldn't have him as my babysitter.
I was kind of
squirrely. I
was
believe him. On the other hand, there are many people who you could have made a film about who would have to go free under the law, and we would be saying, oh my God, what have we done? So there are no free lunches. And every time we err on the side of liberty over safety, we pay a heavy price. My argument is we have to continue to pay that price because terrorists are dangerous, child molesters are dangerous, but there's nothing more dangerous than a government with the power to oppress, given that power without limitations and constraints.
When you mentioned the babysitter, it made me want to ask Aaron one more question before we go to the audience, and that is, there were times sitting in my seat, I was starting to feel a little squirmish watching this guy. Were there times in his living room where you were ever a little uncomfortable?
We filmed with Gil numerous times. There was there was a relationship that formed.
Yeah.
And there are always some moments because I knew in the back, when you see this case and those thoughts are in your head when you meet him, it's hard. You inflect that sort of that thinking pattern on him, which is, potentially not fair. I knew so much about the darkest part of him, and yet I had to look at kind of the lightest part of him.
Well, when you show the pictures of him at age 1, It's nothing we'd seen on television or in the tabloids in all the coverage of this case. We hadn't seen the light. We'd only seen the dark.
This is true.
And Julie, I guess that would be the struggle you had and the struggle you all had with this case from day one.
It is, and people's reaction just highlights the challenge of this case. This case, there really was no evidence of real-world acts, but people just couldn't get past. You know, today it's the punchline of the quote-unquote the Cannibal Cop. In the beginning, it was the horrifying thought of the quote-unquote Cannibal Cop, and you could never get past that label. And you said before whether the label of Cannibal Cop kind of shaped the case. We often talked in the defense, if Gil was the plumber, if it was Joe the plumber, would this case ever have been what it was? And I think it wouldn't have been, because the evidence was so slim that they would have realized, you know, you just have an everyday guy on the internet talking about some really weird stuff as he masturbates to it, because that's what this really is. And the fact that he was a police officer is why this went so far, despite the fact that there really is no evidence other than the internet.
Let's take questions from the audience. I saw a hand right here in the front row to begin with.
So first I want to say I love the documentary. It's fascinating panel. But I find the title to be a misnomer, because the issue is not thought crimes. Nobody can prosecute you for what you're thinking. They prosecute you for what you express in this case. And he expressed in creepy chat rooms in painful detail, and to me that's very different than what you're thinking. You know, this is a conspiracy from my perspective.
But I think in the modern world, there really is no difference. I understand that, and I thought about this a lot. But today, the internet and what we put in the Google box, like
Yep.
you said, is our thoughts. It's just we have a different way of doing it. And who amongst any of us have not sat down and a weird thing pops in our head and we're like, let me Google it. It is. And that's why this case is so fascinating to me, because it is the modern thought prosecution. It is not the thought prosecution of your grandfather. It isn't. It's the modern thought prosecution, because Googling and the internet, this black hole we think it is of our thoughts, is exactly that.
But
Could
I
there
think
have
you're-
been a prosecution without him IMing other people? If he'd only Googled and not had a conspiracy charge?
No way.
No.
No way. No way.
Well, people get prosecuted for terrorism on just Google searches. I want to come back on what Julia said and say this is a incredibly modern film in many, many ways. That's what I admire so much about it. I mean, we tell so many different stories about ourselves as human beings, and the internet muddies the waters between those stories. And this is why I think Erin is such an extraordinary journalist, as she manages to use the film format, to tell those stories without making it simple, never making it simple, always making it human. I take my hat off to her.
Every time it goes a little bit in one direction, you always go back to the other side.
But I think the
yeah.
questioner made a very good point, and that is we have to understand this is on a continuum. A thought crime, a genuine thought crime, is what they used to do in England in the Middle Ages, compassing the death of the king, imagining the death of the king, then expressing that view. That becomes our First Amendment. Now we're moving a little bit further from expressing the view to pressing a button on Google. It's a continuum. You may be right that we ought to, as a matter of construction of our Constitution, include Googling within the protection of the First Amendment. But I think you have to acknowledge that there's a difference between a pure thought crime, expressing the thought crime, making the Google, connecting with somebody else, and ultimately moving toward the harmful act itself. And
we had
that's
a-
the hard decision we have to make in a civilized society.
Another question. Let's go up here toward the back with the hat on.
So basically, there was a sting operation. There was somebody named Richard Meltz, there was Christopher Ashe, and there was Michael Van Hise. Christopher Ashe had had the implements of torture. That was a step beyond. That's basically, and he actually ended up taking, he was, eventually incarcerated. And the line is kind of even grayer with Michael Van Hise. There was a lot of similar chats. That's what he was talking about, members of his family and things like that. But he did meet with one of the co-conspirators earlier than, when he was arrested. So these are cases where there are further steps, but it's still, it's still very sort of gray.
And Aaron, if I could just, Mike Van Heist was not convicted of conspiring with Gill. In fact, he originally was charged with conspiring with Gill. Then the government realized that the evidence was so weak on that conspiracy that they took him out of that conspiracy and they put him in another conspiracy.
But-
Moody Blues was never charged in a conspiracy with us. He was prosecuted in England on something totally unrelated.
Show you how hard it is for civil libertarians. We civil libertarians don't love stings. We think stings sometimes can pose great dangers to civil liberties. You're manufacturing crime, you're creating crime. But here, stings serve a very positive purpose because you have the FBI agent posing as somebody saying, will you take the next step? Whether it be in terrorism, whether it be in assassinating the president, where stings work all the time, or whether it be here or in child pornography. So stings are good. So I want to ask our distinguished lawyer, I know how she'll answer the question, what do you think this guy would have done if an FBI agent had gotten on the phone and said, by the way, this is a great idea you have. I can make it happen. Let's meet tomorrow. You have the idea. I have the equipment. Let's see if we can actually kidnap somebody. What do you think he would have done?
Absolutely nothing. In fact, if you look at the chats, and it's you guys don't get all the chats, there's plenty of times in the storytelling where people say, let's meet tomorrow, and then they never meet.
Right.
Or they say, let's kidnap her tomorrow. They never meet. Mike Van Heist, you know what? Send me that $5,000. They don't exchange bank account information. The next conversation, now they're talking about a $10,000 fee. Gill would have done nothing, and that's why this prosecution is so scary. Because if they had done the sting, this wouldn't be here. And we wouldn't be so scared because Gill would have done what he always does and said, no way. Gill never gave information about these women other than their first name. He always gave fake identifying information, and he never exchanged information with the people. He never told them his name, his bank account, his address, how they can meet. So your question is the easy one for me because there's absolutely no question based on the evidence that he wouldn't have done
It's a strong
anything.
argument.
And
Michael?
Yet the
Oh, Andrew.
film also shows that there were moments when he was in his chats and said that if he could get away with it, that would be an absolute truth. And I think that's what the film is trying to do, is to accommodate these very important legal
Yeah.
principles, but also show that this man and many others of the 40,000 on this website have obsessions and ideas that are really scary.
Michael?
Yeah, you know what my favorite part of the whole movie was, based on over 20 years of experience in not only working with inmates and defendants and really cases where I like to tell my wife, I like to tell my family that I know a lot more than I wish I ever had to learn. I think my favorite part was the whole thing about Match.com at the end, and I'll tell you why. Because you can't tell when someone's dangerous. You can't tell when someone's a monster. There's a monster in this room watching this production that we're doing right now. You can't tell.
Is that like a version of look to your left, look to your right at college graduation?
No, but hang on a second. I'm not saying that I'm not saying it in an ominous way. I'm saying it because the people that we examine are just like us. They're human. They have human urges. They have deviant urges. There isn't an all or nothing experience. There's a human side, just as the human side. This is a man who a woman fell in love with. And this is a man who, for all intents and purposes, look, he passed the police department psychology exam.
Wow.
He was somebody's partner. He was helping the community. He had a lot of positive aspects of him.
Child,
And,
yeah.
and these coexist with deviant aspects, and that's the way they all are. Okay, and that's what makes our job as forensic psychiatrists so difficult. Here's one thing that I hope you all remember if you forget everything I said. It's this. No matter how smart you are, no matter how experienced you are as a forensic psychiatrist, your skill, your experience, your sophistication will never match the desire and determination of the person you examine to manage your impression. That's why it's all about evidence, evidence, evidence. It's evidence from a legal standpoint, but also from a psychiatric standpoint. You have to verify because anybody can be fooled, and the more you do this, the more you realize you're not so smart. You can't tell. Everybody looks human because everybody is human.
Lots more questions, but we're out of time. I do want to ask Aaron one last question, which is Match.com. Why'd you end with the dating profile? Tell us about that choice.
So we filmed up until the bitter end. That was in January 2015, when we filmed this. That was the next part of the story. Gil Valley was out of prison, and he was like, you know what? It's time for me to start dating. I want to date somebody. And so it really was that we wanted to depict what the next step in the story was. And it's also, I say it again, it's a little bit, I made the movie with Andrew and Sheila and Sarah. It's a hard movie to watch, and we need to go to the light.
I don't think any of us are going to forget this film. Thank you all. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Andrew. Congratulations.